Questions on my mind. We had our scripture reference, Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to God, but what is revealed. That's the theme of this message. These are questions that have been on my heart, as I mentioned. Sometimes I'll be reading something in a book and a thought will strike me. Sometimes I'll be watching documentaries on TV, or sometimes I'll have a question and all of a sudden a Bible verse will come to my mind, and I know it's God working to give me the answers to these questions. They're not all my questions, but I hope they're questions that will be of value to you, that you'll get something out of. Our first question: was the ark built by hand? You can see this picture I got off of the internet. Now, this gentleman has holding a hammer. Do you think he built that ark with that hammer? Do you think he didn't use a skill saw or a drill press or a router? Did Noah use power tools? Did they have technology in the time? Well, you consider Matthew 24:37, what Jesus said about how our day would be like Noah's day. To me, that says they had technology. In Genesis 6:14, Noah was commanded to make the ark waterproof in a specific way, pitch or asphalt. Now, asphalt is a petroleum product, and as we know, natural petroleum was formed by vegetable and animal remains that were subjected to tremendous heat and pressure. The creation geologists believe that this occurred when antediluvian life forms were buried by the flood. Yet the Genesis account clearly states that Noah was to waterproof the ark with asphalt, which raises the question, was a petroleum product such as asphalt in existence before the flood? Think about that. Yes, it must have been, and since it did not happen naturally, we must assume it was produced artificially, which presupposes a highly advanced knowledge of chemistry, particularly in the area of hydrocarbons. What Secrets of the Lost Races is, about the same time the book Chariots of the Gods came out, which said that the Egyptians were stupid and that they needed the help of space aliens to build the pyramids, Rene Nuremberg took some of the same evidence, and he said, no, what it was from Adam to Noah, they were smart. They had time, and they built up a technologically advanced society based on his study of Genesis and evidence throughout history, things like the Nazca lines, things like the pyramids. And this is his position. Instead of space aliens, they were smart. I want to show you this. This is Genesis 22:6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. I was watching a documentary once, and they explained at this point in history how they transported fire. When they were camped, because they were all nomads, and they had their fire, then when it was time to go, they'd put that fire out and they'd light the end of a long rope that they had coiled up inside a pouch. They didn't have matches, they didn't have flint. This was how they transported fire in those days. As over days and days and days, the coil would just burn and burn and burn slowly inside this pouch. And every time they needed to stop and make a new fire, they would just take out the burning end and use it to kindle the kindling and start a new fire. So the conclusion I've drawn from that is whatever technology did develop in the 10 generations between Adam and Noah was lost in the 10 generations between Noah and Abraham. How long were the Israelites in slavery? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? 400 years. That's how everybody says that. 400 years in slavery, right? If you go by Ussher's chronology, which is what a lot of Bible scholars go by, the 400 years has to start with Abraham. And agreement is actually found for this in Patriarchs and Prophets in the appendix note number 3 that the editors put in. The statement in Exodus 12:40 that the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years gives the impression that the Israelites from Jacob's entry into Egypt to the Exodus actually spent 430 years in the country of the Nile. That this impression cannot be correct is obvious from Paul's inspired interpretation presented in Galatians 3:16-17, where the 430 years are said to cover the period beginning when God made his covenant with Abraham until the law was promulgated at Sinai. So if you do the math and work out when this time period starts, at what point in Abraham's life and go through the numbers and the genealogy of how old he was when he had his sons, and how old Isaac was, and how old Jacob was. And slavery didn't start until Joseph died. And who knows if it started immediately after Joseph died. So I'd guess 150-ish, my guess, 150 years, they probably were actually in slavery. Of course, slavery is a terrible thing, and it was a sad thing. But just something to think about. Our next question, what's the significance of Daniel 2? Have you ever wondered why we always, when we do prophecy seminars, why do we always start them with Daniel 2? This is the point. You see, we've got our Babylon, Greece, Persia, Greece, Rome, divided Europe. This is the point at which our modern scholars, our archaeologists and our historians can accurately trace history back to. We can prove everything from Daniel's time forward. And though we have faith in the Bible, and we have faith in God, not everybody does today. Why? Because a lot of the archaeology and the history before this time is not 100% provable. So here's the point where the transition began from ancient history to modern history. And God starts at that point with a prophecy that is 100% accurate. So because it came true, you can trust the rest of the Bible. Adam and Eve really happened. There's some scholars, they don't even believe David happened, let alone Abraham or the flood, but it all happened. It's all true. And it's all truth as well, which is more important. Now, our next question. This is a question that was raised to me by one of Melissa's friends. Why was one man put to death in the Old Testament for gathering sticks on the Sabbath? And yet another man is told by Jesus himself, take up your bed and walk on the Sabbath in the New Testament. Does that sound like a contradiction to you? No? Parent contradiction. Good for you. Jesus made both decisions, right? So Jesus wouldn't contradict himself. The Old Testament man, the issue wasn't the sticks. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The issue was he'd been told time and time again, and he still wouldn't listen. The issue was the bold defiance of his heart. Take up your bed and walk. If you cross-reference with Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, what you'll come to understand is it's a symbol. While the Old Testament man was trying to meet his own needs, not trusting God to meet his own needs, but the message to the New Testament man here, how many of us are going to find out when we get to see Jesus face to face that he could have done more in our lives, but there were points in our lives where we believed our problems were bigger than his power. And so we're the ones holding ourselves back by our lack of faith. Take up your bed and walk really means don't let your own sins hold you back. Don't let your own problems get in God's way. You see? Next question. Why did the New Testament writers write like they thought Jesus would return in their lifetime? I raised this question when I was 20 years old, my first time going through the Bible. I started when I was about 15, just read a page a night, and I got all the way through into the latter part of the New Testament. And here I am wondering, it's 2,000 years later, why did they write like they thought Jesus was going to return in their lifetime? This is a question you probably already know. I think we discussed it in Sabbath school about 6 months ago. It's explained by the truth about death. You go into the grave, you go to sleep, you come back up on resurrection day. For you, there's no time in between. So from your point of view, the second coming of Christ and your own death are one and the same event. So that's why the Bible was written in this sort of cryptic way, because for every person in every generation, it's as if the second coming of Christ is going to be at the end of their lifetimes. And another reason, something I like to call multi-level prophecy. Places in the Bible like Matthew 24, another good example, Isaiah 65. Last half of Isaiah 65, you've got a mixture of prophecies regarding the restoration of Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity, and prophecies of New Jerusalem, because one was to be a model of the other. And you look at Matthew 24, there's always been wars, there's always been famines, there's always been earthquakes. They've been getting more and more and more as we're getting closer. But those who weren't going to live all the way to the end, maybe we're going to see a famine or a war or an earthquake in their time and think, okay, Now I need to get ready. And that's the purpose God had for it, for that person. Next thought here. If you've never thought about it, church history is really a parallel repeat of Israel's history. There are equivalencies. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. You look at the time of the early church, they had no central leader. That compares to the book of Judges, when God was ruling directly. But Israel sinned by asking for a king, right? And who's the king of Christianity? Justinian declared the Bishop of Rome. After this three-way jockeying around for position between Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople, the Bishop of Rome finally comes out on top. And Justinian confirms it in 533. 538, he's free to exercise his power. And that's when the prophecy begins. So the Pope is essentially the king of Christianity. Now, most of the Old Testament kings led the church astray at the time, and just like in the Middle Ages, most of the popes led the church astray into darkness. It's called the Dark Ages. We also had a time in the Old Testament where Israel was divided into two countries, Israel and Judah. And the church experienced a great schism. I can't remember the history right off the bat, the exact number, 9th, 10th, 11th century, somewhere around that. It split into the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But just as Israel faded away in the storyline of the Old Testament, and we were left with just Judah, that's why they're called the Jews today. The Orthodox Church isn't really focused on prophetically in the book of Revelation. It's all focused on the Catholic Church. Now, you can even, it's a little more loose of an interpretation. You can even draw some equivalencies, if you want, between the Protestant Reformation and the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, because the reformers were coming out of Babylon. It's been about the same time period, from the Restoration to the time of the first coming of Jesus, as it has been from the Reformation to our time and the closeness we are to the second coming. And just as they did start off with the Restoration, but they still fell away, Jesus had to start all over with the church. In our time, the preaching of the three angels' messages are creating a rift within Christianity. And one side is becoming Babylon, and one side is becoming the remnant. And Jesus is basically starting over with the remnant church. Now, it's going to bring in some more questions here. Here's a thought. We were always taught in school that Columbus sailed west, but we were never told why. Marco Polo went east by land. Why did Columbus have to sail west? Marco Polo went east before 1299. The way was still open because the Byzantine Empire was still in existence. That was the political part of the Orthodox Church. But after 1299, the prophecy of the fifth trumpet from the book of Revelation began, and the Muslims took over. Another parallel equivalency. The Muslims are like the modern version of the Samaritans. And so basically the way to the east was blocked by land. That's why the Europeans had to spread out by sea. That's why, more than just Columbus. You know, we're here in North America, we're taught the explorers that came to North America, but there were other explorers, went around Africa, found their way to the east for the spice trade. But the Ottoman Empire was blocking the way, that's why they couldn't go. Our next question. What is the significance, anyway, of Columbus if the Vikings really did come to North America first? From about the 1960s onward, there was an archaeological discovery in Newfoundland that the Vikings were here first. But the thing is, the Vikings weren't Christians. So in a way, it doesn't count because one, they didn't stay. Two, they were outside the realm of God's people. We're dealing with a sphere of understanding of Western civilization that's been affected by Christianity, that's expanded to take in the rest of the world. But what's been outside has been basically darkness. And this enlightenment has come. Now, this typifies a trend in our society. People today are bending over backwards in any way they can to bring in moral relativism and lessen the influence Christianity has. We're no longer a Christian society here in Canada or in the United States. We're secular societies. It was a just cause, the civil rights movement in the U.S. But under that, people who hate God used it as an excuse to bring in moral relativism. And now we're in a situation where the open sinners of our society, you don't give them everything they want, they'll do everything they can to make you look like you're Hitler's little brother. Because we are a secular society. If you want to offer Bible answers for what you believe in, they'll tell you you're a hillbilly and they won't even listen to you at all. One of the ways this is really noticeable is in the change in attitude toward the Native Americans, the First Nations, the people that used to be called Indians that were here when we came over. And if you were over 45 in the year 2010 or 35 in the year 2000, you grew up in a world where the Pilgrims were heroes. And basically the Indians didn't count. There was racism. We have to face it. But today, using racism as an excuse and diversity as an excuse, we have all this relativism. And if you're younger than that, then you grew up in a world where the Indians were the victims and the white people came over to oppress them. And the biggest form of oppression they had to face was Christianity. I remember hearing once somebody being quoted in the media saying that there was no word for sin in some of these native languages. And these Bible verses here, Acts 17:30. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. And I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Within those dark areas of the world that were not enlightened by the truth, God accepted those people as they were, doing the best they could in the darkness that they had. But He was working through the history of Europe and the changes that happened through the Dark Ages as we came out of them with the Reformation, and bringing truth back to the world. And as the Europeans spread out and extended their cultural influence over the rest of the world, they were given political influence as well. But the Christian church was able to go with them, and God was able to use them to bring peoples of the world to a point of decision. Were they going to go forward with the new truth they were being given? Or if they decided to stay where they were, it was going to result in darkness, because God wanted them to go forward. So He wasn't going to accept any more. He was going to command them to repent, you see. This is the growth process that people had to go through all around the world, not just in North America. Brings us to our next question. You ever wondered why we don't celebrate Jamestown Day? Why we celebrate Thanksgiving? The Queen came over in 2007 to Virginia to celebrate the founding of the Jamestown colony. 1607. And I just found out actually 2 weeks ago that the very first British colony was Newfoundland in 1583. But we celebrate Thanksgiving. Why? That was 1620. They weren't the first people to come here. Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving? Because it's when the Europeans brought God with them that they were really successful. You learn the history of the Pilgrims, and also when Quebec was founded. They went there, they found a piece of land, they said, this is where we're going to put our colony. It was an empty piece of land that no other tribe had come in. The tribe that existed where the Pilgrims landed had died off 3 years earlier, and no other tribe had come in to take that land. So God did have a purpose and a plan, even though there were lots of problems with racism and slavery and things like that over the years. God did have a purpose in leading in the whole thing. Here is a Bible verse on our next slide that basically sums up the last 400 years of North America's history. Revelation 12, 15 and 16. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. The earth is what? The earth is North America, relatively unpopulated region. The sea is what? Where did the flood come from? The flood came from Europe, populated region. A flood of immigrants came over. Some were true to God. They were coming here for religious freedom. Some were only interested in making money. But the more people came, the more land kept getting opened up. And the influence that the Christians had in our society was never able to be swept away until our time, pretty much. There was always that influence because the earth kept swallowing up the flood. Brings us to our next question. Why did the dark day of Bible prophecy happen in the middle of the Revolutionary War? July 4th, 1776. We the people of the United States of America. Well, that's the Constitution, isn't it, George?
Yes.
Declaration of Independence, I don't know how that starts. But July 4th, 1776, the official start of the American Revolution, even though the Boston Tea Party and a few other events happened earlier. The American War, it ended with the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783. So that was a 7-year time period. Smack dab in the middle is May 19th, 1780, pretty much. That's when the Dark Day Bible prophecy happened. Why did the Dark Day Bible prophecy happen in the middle of the Revolutionary War? Those who did come to North America only for benefits in this world and in this life were trying to start a heaven on earth through a change in the political system. But God was trying to draw them because there was wave after wave after wave of Christian preaching in every generation. Something called the First Great Awakening. If you look that up on the internet, you'll find some history about a great wave of Christian revival preaching that happened in North America before America was established. So he wanted to draw them upward instead of a change here, you know, with a new flag and a different kind of government. He wanted to change here. He wanted them to be born again. He wanted them to look to him and to read the Bible and not be deists, etc., etc. That's why. The American Revolution succeeded where the French Revolution failed, because by saying any God instead of no God, it still gave those Christians freedom to keep working, and that influence was kept up. And because of that, God was able to bless both the United States and Canada. And that's why North America has been the most successful part of the world today. Now, aren't we in a wiser, more enlightened age? That's our next question. Haven't we benefited from all this secularism, from all this modernism, especially technology? Well, we just finished the London 2012 Olympics a week ago. Did you know that when they start the torch relay every time for the Olympics, they go up to the top of Mount Olympus and they light the Olympic flame with the rays of the sun? So it has its essence in sun worship. But does that mean because I turn on the TV and watch the Olympics that I'm worshiping the sun? You see, only the essence has been preserved from paganism in our modern day. And because of that, it's a matter of conscience. Some of these things we can do or not do, like taking your kids out for Halloween. You know, it's one thing to go and get a candy bar from a neighbor, but to decorate your whole yard like a cemetery, you know, that's somebody. If you haven't seen it yet, and here's a quote to talk a little bit more about that. A day of great intellectual darkness has been shown to be favorable to the success of the papacy. It will yet be demonstrated that a day of great intellectual light is equally favorable for its success. In past ages, when men were without God's word and without the knowledge of the truth, their eyes were blindfolded, and thousands were ensnared, not seeing the net spread for their feet. In this generation, there are many whose eyes become dazzled by the glare of human speculations, science falsely so called. They discern not the net and walk into it as readily as blindfolded. Great Controversy, page 572, 573. This quote sums up our modern age from the 1840s on, when technology and intellectualism really started to take an uphill climb. And most people today, they're extremely happy, and they will fight for their intellectual freedom, for their political freedom, for their civil freedom. That's a byproduct of the Reformation, but spiritual freedom is what the Reformation was really all about. And most people today don't really want that. And so because of that, God will be justified when he does come and punish the wicked for their sins. It's only those who are truly right with God. It's only those who are truly born again, who have turned from all their sins and love him with all their hearts. They're the ones he's going to take with him to heaven. This is a Bible verse that might seem out of place if you've ever looked at it. It was given just after the Babylonian captivity. And the Greeks, you look at your Daniel 2 statue, the Greeks weren't even going to come for hundreds of years. For I have bent Judah my bow, fitted the bow with Ephraim, raised up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and made you like the sword of a mighty man. Our modern day traces its origins back to ancient Greece. Our first scientists were Aristotle. You learned geometry in grade 8, the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagoras, Euclid, Hippocrates, the founder of our modern medical system. All of our modernism came from Greece. But yet here's a prophecy saying God was going to use his people to do more. And who's the most famous person in all of world history? Who's the one who's been the most influential in all of world history but Jesus Christ? And those who have been his followers are the ones who God has used to change the world for good. This next quote comes from one of the greatest minds of our time, my wife, Melissa. We were in conversation talking about this very topic a couple of years ago, and these were her words. Satan's temptation to us today through the modern world. Don't you want to stay? That's what Star Trek's really all about, the hope that we can solve all our problems after all. Don't you want to believe you really can make heaven on earth for yourselves? In other words, without God, after all. Technology, democracy, the trappings of our modern age, they're only bad when they become an end in and of themselves. We don't have to deny ourselves and go back to the Stone Age in order to serve God. We can serve God with a bread-making machine and a washing machine. We don't have to beat our clothes on a rock. They're only bad when they're used to advance sin instead of righteousness. They're only bad when they become an end in and of themselves. We have a PowerPoint slideshow. You can watch sermons on the internet. Technology can be used for good. And here is another Bible verse in Revelation 12. Revelation 12:17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Focus on that word went. Went as in he went off. Went as in he went away. The conflict that's been listed and described in the storyline of Revelation, between false and true within the church, between the Catholic Church and the Reformers, through all those hundreds of years, has died down in the last 200 years, hasn't it? And what has the church had to deal with as it's gone out to the rest of the world? Communism, atheism, evolution, things like that. We've had an enemy from without. Then people are more worried now. You turn on a mainstream Christian preacher, and he'll tell you a wonderful sermon about the evils of Hollywood and the evils of the music industry and abortion and how wrong it is and how the homosexual activists are such a threat to our society today. And it's all true. But there's an element missing there. People have forgotten. Satan tried to persecute the early church from without, but he also worked at the same time to corrupt it from within. And this change that's being created by the three angels' messages, where one side is becoming Babylon, one side is becoming the remnant, is the working of that corruption from within. But because everybody's paying attention to the enemy without, they're overlooking the fact that prophecy says this conflict is going to return in the very end. Leads us to our next question. What is the significance of 1888? I remember hearing a wonderful sermon about 2 years ago. And I've read a book and I've seen some articles and things like that about how our church was basically promised that if the first generation of Adventists was faithful, that they could have seen Jesus come in their lifetime. But the 1888 General Conference of Minneapolis marked a change and a turning point and showed that we weren't ready. And because of that, even though Jesus could have come very soon afterwards, by rejecting Jones and Wagner, we showed we weren't ready. And so world history went on. Well, I want to show you this pamphlet here. Maybe you've seen it in our bookstores. Rome's Challenge, Why Do Protestants Keep Sunday? We sell that pamphlet. It is quotes from some articles that came out in a Catholic magazine in 1893, shortly after 1888. in which the Catholic leader who wrote them basically said to Protestants, you keep Sunday, you're acknowledging our authority. If you really want to go by the Bible and the Bible only, which is what the Reformation is supposed to be about, then the quote is, you should be a Seventh-day Adventist and keep Saturday holy. You see, God, even though we may not have done enough, even though we may not have been ready, God did make use of us. There was enough of an emphasis that had been put on the Sabbath and the preaching that the Protestant world had been brought to a decision. And that's what these verses in Revelation 3 are all about. The Laodicean prophecy describes a time period from the 1840s to the very end. And as this time period progressed, this hot or cold situation with what God says here, I wish you were hot or cold, therefore because you're not, either I spit you out of my mouth. This is the process of becoming Babylon that I've been talking about. By rejecting the Sabbath truth, the rest of the Protestant world was going back to what they came out of in the 1600s and the 1500s. America is like a religion. It's a secular religion. These words I heard Rudy Giuliani say in an interview just after 9/11. But the thing is, he was quoting Abraham Lincoln. Again, the seeds, even though we saw a major turn towards secularism from the 60s onward, the seeds of secularism were planted back about this time when God used the Adventists to bring the Protestant world to a decision. And the Protestant churches started to lose their influence in North American society. You know what else happened in 1888? The National Geographic Society was founded. That's our next slide. For the rod of the wicked shall not rest upon the lot of the righteous, lest the righteous put forth their hands into iniquity. Melissa got me a subscription this year to Nat Geo, and I get a lot out of it. I like it. But as a creation-believing Adventist, I just cast the evolution aside, but most people can't do that. This has been one of the greatest organs for the advancement of this modern idea that we don't need God, that we can solve our own problems. Because if we just study far enough and wide enough and learn absolutely everything about this world, we can solve our own problems. And basically this kind of idea that's focused in Darwin and evolution has permeated pretty much every university in the world, and the entire intellectual culture of our society is based on this idea that they don't need God. And it's because the Protestants turned away, that their influence started to wane, and that the influence of secularism started to rise. Now, because of that, next question, what should we then think about all the anti-Ellen White and anti-Adventist books, videos, and websites that are out there? This is why people who don't agree with us have to call us a cult. And they have to try and downgrade the spirit of prophecy. Ellen White makes them feel bad because she isn't telling them what they wanted to hear. Just like Jesus wasn't telling the Jews what they wanted to hear. They came to him and they basically said, you're not one of us, therefore you must be wrong. Justify yourself. And having read Questions on Doctrine, you look at all the questions that were asked by Barnhouse and Martin. That's what they were asking the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You're not one of us, therefore you must be wrong. Justify yourself. And I know the Pastor Burke, had a wonderful sermon on the 5% of questions on doctrine that's wrong. I'm talking about the 95% that's right. I'm not disagreeing with it. But basically, you read that book, and the impression, at least I got in reading it, was it's not Adventism that's turned away from the spirit and the power of the Reformation. It's Protestant Christianity. This is where God wants you to be. Now, I've got a quote here from Judd Lake, who is the author of this book, Ellen White Under Fire. Even if the critics were to have assembled 1,000 pages of controversial sayings written by Ellen White, which is profoundly generous, that amounts to only 1% of her entire literary corpus. And in fact, the actual number of pages of sayings that the critics challenge is 0.1% of her writings. So, what that means is God gave 99.9% proof that Ellen White is a true prophet, and that therefore the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the remnant church of Bible prophecy. And yet those who didn't want to hear it chose to stumble over those 0.1% stumbling blocks that he left in his writings. What a thought. Our last question. Why do I feel we really are closer than ever before to the second coming? I had about a half hour more material that I wanted to go through about a detailed set of quotes and questions like this about how we as a church, for the last 7 generations, have not lived up to the message. But you know what? I don't need it. And besides, don't have time. Because I honestly think we are coming out of those struggles. And what I want to do from now on is not guilt us anymore for our failure to live up to the message. It's the message, not the people, but the message is what will change our lives. And we can be what God wants us to be, and God can use us to finish the work. And He has already used us in big ways, bigger ways to change this world than we will ever know. But the reason why I feel we are closer than ever before to the second coming of Christ is because I don't want to tell people who the Antichrist is as much as I want to tell them who Jesus Christ is. But if you feel that way, then we're ready. We're ready for revival. We're ready to evangelize the world. We're ready for God to use us. We look to Him like never before. He will use us.